and today we're at Museum of Fine Art Houston to speak to curator Dumas about the exhibition Vertigo of Color, Matisse, Derain, and Origins of Fauvism. Hi, Dumas. Thank
Hello.
you for joining us today.
It's a great pleasure.
Henri Matisse and André Derain, they are very exceptional figures of the Fauvist movement. I would like to know, how did you curate this exceptional exhibition?
Well, what we're looking at is a rather exceptional moment when these two artists worked together very intensively, just for a short period of 9 weeks in the summer of 1905 in a little fishing village, Collioure, on the South Mediterranean coast of France. Derain was a young artist. He was only 24, right at the beginning of his career, had almost no artistic training. Matisse was 11 years older. He was 35. But even, as we know, Matisse went on to become one of the great artists of the 20th century. But in 1905, even though he was 35 at the time, he hadn't actually had all that much success. He wasn't selling his work particularly well. He hadn't had very many exhibitions. So for both of them, this was a kind of experimental time when they had high ambition. They really sort of hoped to make a big leap forward in their work, which they certainly did.
So I see that Matisse and Daan they had a personal relationship. How did it all begin?
They didn't know each other all that well. They met in Paris. Matisse had a studio in Paris at the time. Derain was living in a little town called Chatou, which is today a kind of suburb of modern Paris. And his parents didn't want him to be an artist at all. They probably wanted him to be a lawyer or a dentist. But Matisse recognized that Derain had some talent, and he said, look, I'm going to spend this summer in the south of France. Why don't you come and join me? And we actually have the postcard, it still survives, that Matisse wrote to Derain, in which he said, I absolutely insist that you come and join me in Collioure. And then Matisse had to write a letter to Monsieur and Madame Derain, Derain's parents, and saying, I know you don't want your son to become an artist, but you should at least let him have a try. So that's the background, and they didn't really know each other all that well until they spent the time together in Collioure. And Matisse arrived first with his wife and 3 small children. Derain was single, and he came a little bit later, and he made quite a stir with the local fishermen when he arrived at the station, because he was a very tall man. He was wearing a white suit and a red cap, and he had this cart laden with all his canvases and paints and painting materials. And the Matisse family really sort of took him in and looked after him.
So what is their artistic relationship like? Who do you think influenced each other more, or was it mutual?
It's a very interesting question that. We do actually know quite a lot about what the artists were thinking at the time. Obviously, we don't know what they were saying to each other, but they did both write quite regularly to friends, often artist friends. And we know that, first of all, and the most important thing is they were absolutely bowled over, sort of intoxicated by the brilliance of the southern light. Matisse had only gone to the south of France the first time the year before, in 1904. Derain had never been to the south of France, and they both came from the north of France, around Paris, where the light is grey and cloudy, and it rains a lot. But so that this brilliant Mediterranean light and the way it changed everything you look at was incredibly stimulating to them. But we also know from the letters that they found it very difficult to represent. Derain wrote saying, the light's like a great shout of victory, he said, but he said, I'm so stupid, I can't work out how to paint it. So they were struggling. I mean, the pictures appear, because they're so colourful, as if they're just full of joy and happiness. But actually, the artists were very anxious about making them. I think one thing that really emerged for me curating this exhibition was that the works that are very different. The works that Derain did and Matisse painted, even though they were working together a lot, are very different. And in a rather surprising way, because Matisse went on to become the greater artist. And, we're talking about 1905 here. Matisse didn't die till 1954, so decades, or almost 50 years. And during that time, he just went on and on developing and became, along with Picasso, the greatest artist of the 20th century. Derain, on the other hand, this moment right at the beginning of his career was in a way his greatest moment, because a few years later, around the time of the First World War, he changed his style dramatically and became a much more conservative, less radical artist, painting very kind of conventional, realistic subjects in rather dull colours of browns and greys. But at this point, the moment captured by this exhibition, Derain is much bolder. He's, as you'll see, looking at all the first wall in the exhibition, where we have a great series of these wonderful, brilliant paintings that he did of the fishing port in Collioure. That was a subject that engaged him the most. And they're very confident, very strong, very fully worked compositions, always with his signature. Because one thing he's very conscious of, as was Matisse, is they're doing all these works with the intention of exhibiting them at the major annual exhibition in Paris, the Autumn Salon, the Salon d'Automne, which took place when they got back to Paris in the autumn. And they wanted to make their mark with this surprising new work. But when we look around the exhibition, what Matisse is doing is much more experimental. He's not so concerned with making completed paintings as making studies which are kind of raw material that he would use to create more finished paintings in his studio in Paris in the autumn. I should just mention just a little bit about why are they called Fauves or Fauvism.
Yes.
Because when they did show their works in Paris, when they got back to Paris at the end of the summer at the Autumn Salon, these works caused an absolute sensation of furore. The critics and the public had never seen anything like it, and the public said, who do they think they are? They're insulting us by showing us, these crude, totally wild works. And the critics used words like insane of the artist and said, oh, it's as if you'd given a 3-year-old a box of colours and he didn't know what to do with it. But one critic who kind of got what they were doing a bit more, he said they're not really artists, they're wild animals or wild beasts. And the French word for a wild beast is fauve, F-A-U-V-E. So the term stuck, and they became known as the Fauve artists, and the movement became known as Fauvism. And it didn't actually last very long as a kind of concentrated movement, only about 4, maybe 5 years, but it had a huge impact on the development of modern art throughout the 20th century because of the kind of liberation that it showed, the freedom of touch and this boldness of colour, and the freedom not to have to paint colours, use colours realistically, but imaginatively.
This is quite enlightening. Thank you. Yeah, I see that both of them are drawn to the sea. How do you think each approached their seascape?
They're not really seascapes so much, but they're as much as views of the port.
Okay.
So it's, the life on the port, the fishing boats drawn up on the beach, the fishermen, and then the sea as a backdrop, really. Well, as you can see, if you look at the whole, quite substantial group of views of the port that we have by Derain, first of all, he's using very, very bold colour. I mean, from our perspective now in the 21st century, these works don't, we're not shocked by them. They don't seem so radical. But at the time they did, no artist had used colour with quite this sort of daring and boldness. Sometimes I think Derain was just squeezing the colours straight out of the tube. And also he builds up his composition. I mean, they're never abstract paintings. You can always see what they are. but he adopts a new style which is very simplified. So if you look at some of the boats, for example, you'll see that really they're just like 4 blocks of color, a blue and a red. You can see that it's a boat, but he's not at all interested in any kind of realism or detailed description. And he often leaves quite a lot of the canvas either not painted at all, bare, or with a kind of white ground, so that the white shows through the color and creates this great sense of luminosity. Matisse painted the port a lot less than Derain, but we do have one really beautiful little painting called The Window. And because Matisse was lucky enough to get a studio right on the port, on the second floor in a house, which had French windows that opened onto a little balcony. And then you see the boats and the port beyond. It's a much smaller painting than most of Derain's, but again, it's wonderfully vivid color and this very sort of free use of the brush and very energetic use of the brush. And I would say that the single most important thing, kind of development in terms of the history of art and the development of modernism that came out of this collaboration in 1905, was that the artist no longer felt the need to use color realistically. You know, Matisse once said, just because I paint something blue, it doesn't mean it's the sky. If I paint it green, doesn't mean it's grass. So if you look around, you'll see that the trunks of the trees are orange, magenta, purple, because what they're interested in is not realism, but using color as a means of expressing their personal and subjective response to a subject.
So I see that this room is dedicated to Amélie.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, why Amélie? Tell me more about it. Why was she their main model?
Amélie Matisse was Matisse's wife. Okay. He'd met her in 1895 or 6, I think. He'd met her in Paris and they'd married in 1897. And she reportedly, it was recorded by a friend, once said, I would never marry a man with a beard or with red hair, and definitely not a man who was an artist. And Matisse ticked all of those 3 boxes. So she was a very devoted wife at this stage, at any rate, and she was also, when they were in Collier, was a very frequent model for Matisse and for Derain. And we're sitting here in front of this really, I think, one of the most spectacular works in the exhibition, which is Amélie. You can see she's wearing this kind of white robe with a blue pattern on it. It's often called Madame Matisse in a kimono. I'm not sure that, I don't think strictly speaking it is a real Japanese kimono, but it's, anyway, it's this very striking robe that Matisse had picked up in a flea market. And both he and Derain painted and drew her in this robe. She's holding a red fan. And you have to remember that at this time in the late 19th and very early part of the 20th century, especially in France, anything to do with Japanese art was very popular and very fashionable. And so she's wearing a sort of Japanese robe. She's holding a fan, which can be associated with Japan. But I think what really makes this painting so brilliant is, first of all, the robe itself is very strong, very decorative, the pattern. But then, you know, imagine what it would look like if Derain had just painted it against a kind of neutral white or grey ground. It would be a completely different painting. True. So he's made this really vivid background out of these brilliant reds and greens, very loosely, and you sense a great deal of energy and immediacy in the way that he's actually brushed the paint on. But the contrast between these reds and greens and the blue and white robe really make this painting sing. And nearby we have behind you a pen and ink drawing by Matisse, very different, but the pose of Amélie is so similar that I think that the 2 artists must have been sitting side by side working together. It's just that Derain did a painting and Matisse chose to do a drawing. So obviously we don't have the color in this, but he's still using pen and ink and a brush as well, probably made a very powerful representation of the pattern on the robe. And on the other side of the gallery is one of Matisse's, again, a small painting that we've borrowed from the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And it's almost abstract, this one. It's just a kind of mass of little coloured squiggles of paint. But it's Amélie again, wearing this robe, sitting on a rock by the sea. You see the small painting in the middle there. And what was fascinating is that the drawing next to it, to the right, is by Derain. It's the only drawing by Derain in the exhibition because he tended to concentrate more on paintings. You will see that at the right of the drawing is Matisse wearing a straw hat, sitting in front of an easel with a kind of sketch pad on his lap. And it's actually, so Derain has drawn Matisse painting the painting that you see of Amélie next to it. So that's a very nice thing for a curator to be able to do, to make that kind of connection in an exhibition.
As a curator, I know that this exhibition is very special, but there must be a section that is most special to you. Which section is that and why?
Which section? I don't know, that's hard to answer. I love the first gallery where we were able to show all the scenes of the port. Mm-hmm. And you'll see we've done a big photo mural, a big photo blow-up of a vintage photograph which shows Collioure as it was. But I also think the show's got a fantastic ending because in the last room we look a little bit at what they were doing after 1905, in 1906, how they developed the next year and what they learned from the Collioure experience. And so this has given us the opportunity to showcase a really fantastic painting by Derain called The Turning Road, which belongs to our museum, to the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, and is certainly one of the greatest, modern works in our collection, and is also generally considered one of the great masterpieces of Fauvism. It's a really big painting. It wasn't painted in Collioure, it was painted in another village further along the coast called L'Estaque. Derain never returned to Collioure. Matisse did several years running, but Derain did go back to the south of France, but to different places. So this painting is not Collioure, it's L'Estaque. But you can kind of see how he's still retained that wonderfully brilliant palette that he learned to do in Collioure. But the 1906 painting is a little bit more worked out, a bit more sophisticated in the handling. And we're very lucky because we were able to borrow from the Museum of Modern Art in New York another painting by Derain of exactly the same place, painted at the same time in the summer of 1906. It's smaller than the Houston painting, but it was wonderful to be able to show the two works together. So I think those two moments are the high points for me, the beginning and the end of the show.
Thank you so much. This was very enlightening.
Well, thank you for coming. I hope you enjoy the show.
Find all of our videos and sign up for our newsletter at artthisweek.com. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter.